Let's take a look at both material and color within ZBrush. Now you'll notice up here at the top we have a button called mRGB, another button called RGB, and another one called M. And what this stands for is M being material and RGB being color, red, green, and blue. So let me just paint in a couple of pixels here so that we have something to work with. Now currently you'll notice that the button that is pressed is mRGB, which means that I'm painting both with color and material. Okay, now if we take a look down here at the bottom, we see that there is a palette for materials and there's also a palette for colors. Inside our material palette we're going to have several different options that we can work with. All these different materials have different specular properties, different reflective properties, transparency properties, and we'll even talk about creating our own materials later with the matte cap feature inside ZBrush. But for right now I'm just going to go ahead and select a material like this chrome material, and then I'll paint onto my surface here. Maybe I'll switch over to a glass material, and then I'll paint with that. Now you'll notice as I paint with this glass material we get kind of a white tint or no color involved in the glass material at all, and that's because if you notice down here at our color swatch we have white selected. So I'm going to shift this over to green, and then now you'll notice this glass material has been tinted into kind of a green look. So many of these materials are going to be affected by the color that you choose in your color picker. And again, keep in mind up here we have the mRGB button selected, which means we're painting both with material and color. If we were to just move over to material and click that, it doesn't matter what color I select here in my color picker, the material will just take on its own color. Now you'll notice when I paint, wherever there was green already painted will stay green. That's because that color information will stay put. So let's clear this before it gets too messy. Okay, so now we don't have any color information in our scene, and as I paint with this material, all we're getting is the reflective and transparency and the translucency and the specular properties of this material. We're not getting any color involved at all. Now if I turn off material and just turn on RGB and switch my color maybe over to a blue, you notice that now we're painting blue onto the material we've already worked with. Now as I'm doing this, you're noticing that the pixels that I've already laid down are being deformed. They're getting sculpted. Let's say you just want to paint on something that you've worked with, but you don't want to deform it. That's where this Z add and Z sub come into play. If you turn off Z add by clicking on it, then you're only working with RGB here with this button depressed, which means I can now paint over those pixels without deforming them. If I turn on material and then switch my material to a glass shader, I can then change the shading properties, the material properties of those pixels without deforming them. So you can see by turning off Z add and only working with mRGB, RGB, or M, you can mix between painting materials, painting just colors, or actually deforming the model as you click Z add and then cause elevation to your pixels. So again, I'll clear that one more time. Now if you do go ahead and work with RGB and Z add on, you'll notice that you're not getting any of that shadowing or any of that elevation. You are building up elevation here, but because there is no material property, you're not really going to see it. Where if I turn on material, turn off Z add, and then paint in the material, now we can see what we've worked with. Now let's say that you're working and painting along here. Let me turn off material and back to RGB. So I'll paint a little yellow up here and a little blue over here. Let's say you want to select the exact color you've used before so that you can duplicate it somewhere else. To do this, all you have to do is hover your cursor over that color and then tap the C key. And you notice that my color swatch over here on the left has chosen that color. So I can choose blue, green, or yellow, or whatever I have inside my scene. So take a moment to switch between mRGB, RGB, and M, and then turning Z add on and Z sub on so that you can subtract and add, or turning them off so you can just paint with material or just paint with color. We've already seen that there are several 3D primitives that we can work with inside ZBrush, but let's take a look at how we can change some of their initial settings. I'm going to open my shelf over on the right hand side, go up to my tool palette, click on this swatch and drag this over to the right. I'm going to click on my tool option here, and then again we expose all the different 3D tools that we can work with inside ZBrush. I'm going to click Sphere 3D. Once I have that selected, I'm going to click and drag to draw that into my canvas, and then I'll move up to the Edit button so that I can work with it in edit mode. I'm also going to come over here to the right and click this Frame button. That way, now that I have a frame on it, I can see the dimensions a little bit better. Again, in our tool palette, second from the bottom, we have this pull down called Initialize. Once we open that up, you'll see that there are several options we can change for this 3D sphere. Divisions in the height, divisions in the width, coverage, and you can get objects very different from their initial state. If you want to start sculpting on this, again we can go up to Make Polymesh 3D, and then we can start sculpting. Be aware now that I've created a Polymesh 3D, I don't have my initial settings anymore. So you're going to want exactly the initial settings that you want to work with before you hit this Make Polymesh. Once you do this, you can't go back to those initial settings. But then again, you can start sculpting, hitting Ctrl D to divide, and then working with this new mesh. I'm going to hit Edit, Ctrl N to clear, and let's take a look at another 3D object. So again, I'll click on my tool icon, and this time I'm going to go over to Gear 3D. Again, click and draw to bring that into the canvas, then hit Edit so that I can start working with it. Again, we'll go down to our Initialize option and open that up. Now you'll notice that we have several different options compared to the sphere that we were just working with. Each one of these 3D tools is going to have different options to work with. What's interesting about this gear is that we have these Z-curves that allow us to change the profile of the outer and inner spikes on this, as well as divisions and different profiles. Again, when we're done, we can go up to Make Polymesh 3D. That'll remove any of our initialized settings, but now we can divide by hitting Ctrl D. I'm going to turn my frame off, and then if we want, we can of course start sculpting. So I recommend that you go through all these 3D primitives, check out their initialized settings, because each one of these is going to have very different initial settings that you can work with to create very interesting objects. I'd like to show you the masking features that are available to be done on primitive objects native to ZBrush. Again, I have my tool palette docked over on the right hand side. I'm going to click on the tool icon so I can open this up, and this time I'm going to choose the ring 3D. So I'll click on that, click and drag into the center of my canvas, and then hit the Edit button so I could start working with this. Now you'll notice over in the tool palette down near the bottom we have this masking feature. If I click on that, it's going to open up a few more options. The first thing I'm going to do is click Mask All. That's going to cover this ring entirely with a mask. You'll also notice down here at the bottom that you have an option that says Select and an option that says Skip. This is going to say how many rows I want to select and how many rows I want to skip. Let's make this a little bit more obvious by actually pushing this button, RWO, which stands for rows. And when I do that, it's going to select 8 rows and then skip none. So it's selecting 8 rows, skipping none, and then selecting 8 more rows as far as what it's going to unmask or mask. So let's clear that. Hit the button Clear. Again, we'll mask all. This time I'm going to take my selection down a bit. Let's take it down to 4, and let's take our skip up to 3. Again, I'm going to hit rows. Now you can see that it's selected 4 rows, skipped 3, and selected 4 more. So what good does this masking do? Well, above our masking option inside our tool palette, we have a deformations option. So I'm going to click on that and open that up. And there's a lot of different deformations that we can do on this 3D object. The one I like to work with most is Inflate. So down here close to the bottom we have an inflate option. If I scroll this slider up a little bit, you'll notice that the pieces of this ring that aren't masked start to inflate. The pieces that are masked will stay exactly where they are. So let's scroll back down to masking. I'll hit clear to clear my mask, and again I'm going to click mask all. This time, instead of hitting RWO for rows, I'm going to push the button right next to it, COL for columns. Again, this columns button paid attention to the select and skip options I selected below. Select 4 rows, and then skip 3. And what I mean by rows, if I turn on my frame here, are rows of polygons. I'm going to turn frame off. So again, in my deformations menu, I'll click inflate. I'll just inflate that in a positive value. Scroll back down to masking, and at this point I'm going to hit clear. So you can see you can make very interesting objects or very interesting tools to start off with. Now that I'm done changing this by masking and deforming it, I'll scroll all the way to the top of my tool palette, and then again click Make Polymesh 3D. Now I can hit Ctrl D to divide if I want, and start sculpting however I feel like. Painting a mask on your model will allow you to control which areas of the mesh can or cannot be deformed. To paint in a mask, simply hold down the Control key. You'll notice when I do this my cursor turns yellow. I can then paint on the model a new mask. Anything inside this dark area will not be affected by any sculpting I do. So I'll let go of Control. You'll notice that I'll have my standard brush active. And then as I sculpt on the model, you'll notice nothing inside that dark area is affected. To clear a mask, all you need to do is hold down the Control key and click and drag in an empty area away from your model. That'll clear your mask. Let's undo that by hitting Ctrl Z a few times. Now I'll paint in another mask. Hold down Control, and then paint in your mask. This time I want to affect only the area inside the mask, so what I'll need to do is invert this. I'll hold down Control, and then tap or click in an empty area away from the model. This will invert the mask. Let's switch over to the Blob Brush. Now anything inside that area will be affected because the rest of the model is masked off. Again, let's hold down Control, click and drag in an empty area to clear that mask. Using an alpha is a great way to get a very specific mask. Let's choose the alpha we want to use. I'm going to choose alpha 22, this kind of veiny looking pattern. And let's draw this in over the face of our character. To do this, I'm going to hold down the Control key, start in an empty area, and then just click and drag. When I let go, that mask will be printed onto the model. To invert this, I'll hold down Control and just tap in an empty area. I can now switch my alpha back to a regular one and start sculpting. Hold down Control, click and drag to clear. Now let's say I don't want to draw the mask in this way. This is a very large drag that we did over the model. Let's say we want to apply this mask in a very specific area. We can do this by changing our stroke. So I'll go over to the stroke palette, select drag rectangle, and again I'm going to select alpha 22. This time I'll hold Control and then just click and draw that in wherever I like on the model. Again, I'll click and tap to invert that mask. Let's switch back to a dot stroke and then paint that in. And again, to clear my mask, I'm going to hold down Control and then simply click and drag.